Greetings, Culture Warriors. It is I, Jeff Vieira, the author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this latest dispatch from the front. You know, we've been talking a lot about free speech and the intersection of our cultural values, certainly here in Western culture where free speech is prized, and business. And as I peruse my LinkedIn, as I'm wont to do daily, I notice that there's a lot of politics creeping into LinkedIn, and there's a reliable few who point out that LinkedIn is a platform for business and not politics. But of course, as government grows increasingly totalitarian in the West and the United States in particular, well, politics starts infecting our business discussions more and more and more. I've shared with you how one of the most awful features of this pandemic is we're starting to have Soviet-style conversations with our neighbors, sitting around talking about things like, oh, this supermarket in this town actually had meat. You better get over there. That's never been the case in the United States of America in our history. But here we are today. And so we're starting to see that creep in. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about the conflict in values between our darkening world out there and our businesses, and how that's manifesting itself in many of the stories that I'm covering here and you may be reading elsewhere. So to start with, I think you have to understand that a lot of the totalitarianism we're seeing is coming from the leftist domination of many institutions in the West. So it wasn't that long ago, political correctness first appeared on the scene. I remember it vividly because I happened to be a cadet at the Air Force Academy in the 90s. And you started hearing the phrase politically correct. Oh, don't say this, wouldn't be politically correct. It was used as a pejorative. We started to feel the pressure to not say certain things that previously were just fine. And it was understood that you could have an opinion contrary to what others felt, and it was no big deal. I'll give you, for instance, I worked, while I was at the academy, we had a video sketch show that we put out. And the academy, as you can imagine, is a very pro-American place. It's to produce the future leaders of the Air Force. That's the purpose of it. And in the little Saturday Night Live style intros that we did, quick silent cuts for little video clips to introduce the players in that sketch show, I borrowed one of my classmates' Russian babushka hats. If you've seen these, if you've seen kind of the Red Guard outside the Kremlin and their overcoats in the middle of winter, and they have that big furry cap on their heads, right? That's what it was. So I put on the big furry cap. I put on a black glove, symbolic of the Black Panther movement. I was reading, as we were forced to read as part of our core curriculum, a copy of the Communist Manifesto sitting at my desk, and when the camera panned to me, I gave the fist salute of the Black Panthers. Not incidentally, because the cadet squadron that I was part of was called the Black Panthers. That was the mascot. So the idea was to say, hey, we're rebels here, right? We're revolutionaries. This is a revolutionary show for the academy, that kind of thing. Didn't get in a lick of trouble for that. I got in a lot of trouble at the academy, mind you, but not so much as a raised eyebrow for that. And that was at a time when the Soviet Union had just fallen, but was still the enemy. Most of our doctrine was aimed towards the Russians. So technically, by me wearing a Russian hat with that communist hammer and sickle on it, by doing the Black Panther salute and yada yada yada, I was basically aligning myself visually with America's enemies. And yet nobody, nobody came and gave me a stern talking to for it. Why? It's a joke. It was perceived as harmless. That wouldn't be the case anymore for things that run against the political views of the generals who run the academy. And the difference is political correctness. So I was in my English class, and at the time we simultaneously had a debate going on about the great authors, the great books. And so a couple of the English professors there who were majors, they clearly bought in to all this left-wing nonsense. And so they kept forcing the discussion on us. We're there to actually read the great books, to engage with the great authors. That's the whole purpose of the class we are in. And they would waste time every class bemoaning the fact, and you would hear it this way. Why can't we read Achebe? Achebe was a fashionable socialist African author who wrote a novel called Things Fall Apart, that was in vogue at the time. And every class we would get together, and these clowns who would kind of piggyback their classes, they would tag team them. Why can't we read Achebe? Why can't we read Achebe? Why can't we read Achebe? My sponsor at the academy, and I should explain that when you're a freshman at the academy, you're far from home. You can't get off base very much. So they try and hook you up with somebody in town who can function as your kind of off-base family while you're at the academy. My sponsor happened to be the librarian at the academy. And so one day between classes, I went and said, hey, do you have a copy of Things Fall Apart by Achebe? Oh, sure. We got plenty of those here or there. So I borrowed a copy of Achebe, went to class the next day, and laid in wait. And as soon as they said, why can't we read Achebe? I pulled a copy of Achebe, threw it on his desk, and said, there you go. Now can we read Shakespeare? Now, even a committed leftist, as this major was, in the throes, the birth pangs of political correctness, didn't come down on little Cadet Vieira, head and shoulders, for that act of insolence. Why? Because there was a respect, especially in the classroom environment, that you were allowed to have opinions. You were allowed to state opinions, even where there was a rank difference. And that, especially in classes like English and history, you were allowed to debate, to discuss, to take contrary positions that other people might not agree with, to argue it out. That was the point of the experience. Even if it wasn't, quote, politically correct to do so. There was a lot of fear at the time among my history teachers because one, I had never had him in class, but one of the history professors there had written a book on Vietnam and the application of air power in Vietnam, and it called into question various shibboleths that the Air Force leadership had regarding the Vietnam experience. And so he was a captain at the time, and there was a fear that he would never make major because of that book. So it wasn't as if it was a free speech wonderland in the United States Air Force, certainly. People were afraid, in some cases, that taking views and putting them in print could have consequences for your career. I experienced some of those consequences later on for something I put into print, but that's another story. The point of it is, is that political correctness had landed by the mid 90s. Actually, I'm sorry, the early 90s, uh, in a place that was, you would think, would be as immune to it as the United States Air Force Academy. I wrote for the literary journal. One of the stories I wrote for it was, had a little bit of a shocking beginning. Nothing, pornographic or grotesquely violent or anything like that. But it managed to get the entire literary journal run banned, which was a bit of a shock. The whole point of a literary journal is to write stories and publish them in the literary journal, and to have stories that were considered so deeply offensive to the grown-ass man who ran the English department, and who, no mistake, was a big-time leftist himself. He liked to get people to cut his Shakespeare class on day one. So if the class was too big, he didn't want to do all that work. So what he would do is he would go on a lengthy diatribe about how Shakespeare was homosexual. Again, that was an argument that was rather in vogue at the time. I'm sure that if it had been a little later, he probably did the same, claiming that Shakespeare was black or that Shakespeare was a woman. Probably to less effect. But when the guy starts nattering on and on and on about the alleged homosexuality of Shakespeare, when even I knew that the sonnets were written on commission and that men of the age had a little more intense friendship and flowery discourse than we are accustomed today, even I knew that back then, I just didn't want to sit through political polemics that had no relevance to Elizabethan England when Shakespeare was writing. And so I dropped the class. It was literally the only class I dropped in my entire time at the academy. But the guy was clearly a jerk. He put politics into his class instead of just teaching us the subject matter. And so he infected it and made the class useless to education. I love Shakespeare. So instead I wound up reading all of Shakespeare's plays on my own. I'm sure many others did. One of the first instances where we had the cadets becoming infected with the politically correct virus came about in a history class. We were taking the history of Vietnam, and ironically, we had a civilian professor from a very liberal college in town who was teaching that class. And he was doing the pre-war colonial experience of the French and explaining that the French missionaries had gone over to Vietnam, and when they got there, the mortality rate was ridiculously high. Most Vietnamese babies would die before they reached the age of 2. In part, it was because they were fertilizing their fields with human feces, which led to the spread of diseases like cholera and dysentery. And that was something that could very easily carry away the life of a small child. So the professor was highlighting the intentions of those French missionaries in bringing sanitation and other service to Vietnam, and how some of those things that they did were having a positive impact, raising the life expectancy of children. And one politically correct cadet could not help but raise her hand and say, "But professor, what right did they have to impose their culture on others?" And this took the professor aback quite a bit, to the point where he just sort of muttered, "Well, most people around the world want their children to live." But it had already gotten to the point where cadets themselves were starting to take aboard the politically correct notions of their fellow collegians. So I say all this just to point out that at that time, the left's march through the institutions of higher education was pretty much complete. The leftist march through the ranks of the military, the officer ranks in particular, was just beginning. Bill Clinton's administration would really start with interference in the officer promotion system to a much greater degree than had been the case in the history of our military, to start to shape senior officers to a model more to the liking of leftists. But that was just at the beginning. And the military, if you want to have a career in the military, people shift very quickly. Once they see what's going on with the generals, who's getting picked for general, who's getting picked for colonel, they fall in line. And that's exactly how they did it there. Business was largely immune to this because leftism is just, it's not really, it doesn't help you succeed in business, right? Now, in some countries where political interference is high, think of China, then that's a different story. But in the United States of America and in most of the West, what mattered was serving your customers, building a better mousetrap. But as the other institutions fell, the media, the entertainment industry, churches, the military, as they fell to domination by a leftist minority, that totalitarian mindset of the left would not tolerate allowing businessmen to operate with impunity. And you would see this first and foremost through the media lens, because who, from the 90s onward, who were the villains in most Hollywood films? The heavies. The guys who previously would have been, say, the Nazis or the commies. Who were they? They were corporate CEOs, businessmen. You know, there was a season of 24 there where 24, the showrunners didn't want to be accused of, beating the Islamic terrorist drum too much, even though Islamic terrorism was at an all-time high, the post 9/11 world. So instead, they brought in a character who was a businessman with a Bluetooth in his ear constantly. And that was kind of how all those shows went. Suddenly, businessmen were the bad guys. All these businessmen. Bad, 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 bad. They started a simultaneous push by claiming that those businessmen were largely white and male, old white male. Same way they came for the great authors, by the way. The complaint was, well, why are we reading all these dead white guys? Why should we read these guys? They're dead white guys. And so they used the same tactic with regard to business leaders. They're just old white guys. Why should we listen to them? And the point was to undermine it so that you could get people in positions of power who are more amenable to what the leftists were slinging. And by God, that has happened. So when you take the leftist, whose religion is politics, and you allow them to dominate an institution, as we've allowed them to dominate so many, well, they're going to proselytize their religion, which is politics. And politics are going to infect everything. And so now you have the spectacle of business where the culture had previously been, the culture is king, the customer is king, the customer is always right, to now you have businesses that are actively firing their customers. Jeff Bezos just did this. We covered it in a podcast some weeks ago. Jeff Bezos just did this, coming out basically saying, if you don't support Black Lives Matter, then Amazon doesn't want to serve you. This is from a company that has prided itself from its inception in the 90s as value number one is customer focus. Well, no longer. So we're at an interesting time where that leftist minority, stretched as thin as can be in the United States of America, is reaching to close out all opposition in business by amplifying the outraged voices of their small minority through the media that they control absolutely, to make it sound as though it is people who have classic business values who are the tiny minority. It's been fascinating to see, because you have to understand that leftists, when they take over institutions, because there are so few of them, they cannot take over by having a majority vote, say. That used to be kind of the model with labor unions, but leftism has long since lost its appeal to the common worker. They're too smart for it. So instead, what they do is they take over the hierarchy. They go in at the top and take that over. And they use blacklists and things like that to help affect that takeover of institutions. And then once they have enough of the hierarchy in place on it, everybody else has to fall in line or lose their job. And you've also seen over this period a remarkable revolving door between Democrats in office and business, big business. Goldman Sachs for the longest time. Citigroup. Citigroup was founded to be that revolving door between the Democrat pols. So they would take their politicians who had lost election, and they would plant them in these companies where they'd milk it for money. The classic case was Jamie Gorelick, who was infamously the architect of the wall between the FBI and CIA that led directly to the terrorists being able to pull off the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11/2001. She was the person behind that, the one person who most contributed to the failure of the government to prevent that attack. And where did she go? Well, she went over to Fannie Mae, which is the government's low-income mortgage lender, where she was promptly at the epicenter of the financial crisis because she milked Fannie Mae for so long and took on a bunch of mortgages that would eventually default. So again, you can look it all up. The history is pretty fascinating. Who is Jamie Gorelick? She's just a Democrat functionary. I don't think she's ever been elected to anything unless something has happened fairly recently. But studying the careers of people like this and how they somehow move, what mortgage knowledge did she have to go run Fannie Mae? Absolutely none. It didn't matter. She was a high muckety muck for the Democrats. What does she know about the Department of Justice? Not a lot, apparently. And so you see, as the corruption spreads, that it facilitates the movement of these operatives between government and business. And when they get into the business, they generally do a lot of damage to the business. So what's the takeaway from all this? Well, I think it's simply this. John O'Sullivan used to be the editor of National Review. He was a British gentleman, Tory, Thatcherite. And O'Sullivan coined a law that is to politics these days what gravity has been to physics. And that is this: any organization which is not overtly right-wing will become left-wing over time. That has proven to be the case, by the way, with National Review, the magazine that he edited, which used to be a conservative stalwart, but which now, in the age of Trump, is no different, really, than any other left-wing magazine out there. It's the bastion of the never-Trumpers, who are increasingly revealed, as Bill Kristol has been, to be allies of the left. They're actively seeking right now Joe Biden's victory in the fall presidential election. And I think that the truth behind O'Sullivan's law is simply this: principle must be defended. Values must be defended. Values without defenders are like fortresses without men on the walls. They simply fall. And so if you value free speech and free discourse, well, you have to be willing, when political correctness raises its head, you have to be willing to throw a copy of Achebe on a major's desk and say, there you go, pal, read it to your heart's content. I want to read some Shakespeare, please. I had another instructor at the academy in those days. You may remember the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This kicked off a leftist revisionist view of the colonial experience with Native Americans in the settlement of the United States. And they completely bowdlerized and washed out the atrocities committed by Native Americans on European settlers. So you would, for example, they tried to claim that scalpings, where you grab someone by the hair and use a tomahawk to remove their scalp. You cut right into their skull and remove their scalp. Rip it off by the hair after you make that cut. These scalpings, they claimed, were just a function of the fact that Europeans had shorter hair. Now, it didn't matter that they had long hair Europeans, and long hair was relatively fashionable in the West for much of the time, and women who were scalped. So it was just a nonsense argument to basically pardon Native Americans from having committed any acts of violence, which they clearly did. Historically, there's tons of evidence, first-hand accounts of it. That's what comprised Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and other books of the time, which kind of served to make these proud Indian warriors who were not afraid. You know, they lived a really violent and difficult lifestyle even before European settlers came to the New World. These were not pajama boys in their parents' basement. These were tough men who weren't afraid to fight with whatever weapons they have and fight to the death much of the time, who would inflict the most horrible tortures upon their captives. And yet they had to be sanitized for the left because the Europeans had to be the comic book villains. And so we were asked to write a paper on Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee as kind of the vanity project of this professor, who was very obviously a leftist professor. And so he was so on and on about it. This was an American history class, so this was only part of the class. This was one portion of it. But my goodness, he would bring Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee up whenever you're talking about anything in that class. And so when it finally came time to write that paper, I conspired with the rest of the cadets in the class to put on really inflammatory titles on each paper, to strike back against kind of the political correctness of it. And so I remember my paper was something like how true Americans defeated the terrible barbarian savages in South Dakota or something like that. And so he gets these papers in, and he has to read the titles of these papers, and each one is worse than the last, right, in terms of offending political correctness. Now, to his credit, he didn't fail all of us, right? He graded the papers as they were written. He understood the point, and he had respect for free speech and academic freedom, as liberals historically had. He had that vestigial respect for it and for his own duty, that he laughed at the joke and he pressed on. But the point is, these days, who would even have the stones to do something like that? You'd be hauled before a board at your college and expelled. How dare you say such things? They would find somebody who had, 3,264th Native American blood to show up in a headdress and do the ironized Cody thing with the tear trickling down the bronze. Well, it probably wouldn't be bronze. The lily white cheek, and tell you how you made it an unsafe place. This is the Orwellian nightmare that we've come to. But the bottom line of it is you can fight these absurdities before they become too powerful. And it's not too late yet in the United States of America and the West. All you have to do is laugh at it, mock it. That's all. If you value free speech, if you value business being a politics-free zone where you actually focus on the customer, where you don't care if the person working next to you is a Trotskyite, or you don't care that the person sitting next to you is a Burkean conservative who knows why the American Revolution was good and the French Revolution was bad and can tell you so. You don't care because it ain't part of business. If anything, you may make small talk about it from time to time on break, but you're focused on satisfying the customer. If you want to return to a world where that is possible, then you need to start pointing out the emperor has no clothes with regard to the nonsense pronouncements of the left, and stop humoring them. You need to have some guts. And isn't courage really the value that ensures all other values can exist? At the end of the day, my friends, comfort and politeness and comedy, COMITY, are one thing. But culture is everything. Thank you.